welcome you to this webinar on connecting research to impact through identifiers, metadata, and citations. A lot of the work that we do with research data management and implementing the FAIR principles is what some term the love letter to yourself, the thing that you use later or others reap the benefits of. Today is really fun because it's going to be about how you can reap the benefits of some of this work that you're doing and in a way that helps you show impact either for your own research or your own repository or data resource and things that you can start doing today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Reed Chapman from NIAID's OddSet.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you all for making time again to join. Thank you, Lisa Mayer, Dasha Pukunaya, and members of OddSet for helping put this together. I just wanted to just briefly highlight this is a webinar that is hosted by our office, led by GoFair US, and is connected to this work we've been doing on the NIAID landscaping and verification project. Next slide, please. And just really quickly to that end, one of the activities that we had worked on is something that we call short-term the NIAID blueprint. This is a fairly high-level document that strives to lower barriers to data access and reuse through a shared framework. And for folks that are really into data, we find this subject really exciting. Sometimes it can get lost in a lot of the details of certain technical terms and things of that nature, but really it's all towards a broader goal of how do we get to that vision that we always discuss about data being able to connect, and really we're going to focus today on the impact of the data that's being generated. So just really quickly, I'm not going to tell you all about the blueprint, but there are 5 key categories outlined in the blueprint, and we're focusing today on number 4, citation guidance, which sort of provides guidance to the research community on how digital objects should be cited. And hopefully you can hear the perspective from the GoFair team and a lively discussion to follow. So with that, I will hand it over to our next presenter, and thank you again for joining.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. We're excited to present some of the material today. And, we have a great presentation, so buckle up. It's going to be fun. So let's go a little bit over what we hope you will get out of this time that we spend with you. There are sort of 3 major areas that we're going to focus on. One is focusing on identifiers as the foundation for impact assessment. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what kinds of identifiers that are available for you to use in your repository, how you might think about which identifiers would be appropriate for your particular resources. We're going to talk about the ability for you and sort of strategy that you might implement for creating citation recommendations. So one of the most important aspects of what we're trying to encourage here in this presentation is to think about how you would make your identifiers visible so that they are more citable. Without a good strategy for that, the third part of this, or the third component of this webinar, which is about measuring impact and understanding how to track these things, without having a good foundation for how to develop a citation strategy and making those identifiers visible, then the measuring impact is very difficult for us to do. And in that third component of measuring impact, we're going to talk about what are the ways in which you might look at the research influence of the resources and data sets, et cetera, that you might be exposing through your repository. So we know that there are a variety of people on this particular webinar, from folks who might not know much about what we're talking about to those who know quite a bit and are using and actively integrating these concepts into their work. So we have a little bit for everyone, so that no one is bored. We do have a Q&A tool, which I believe is already in the chat, maybe. And if you have questions or would like to make comments, suggestions, or whatever about our presentation or the things we're talking about, please feel free to drop that into. So, let's begin with this high level question of what is impact really, and how do we get to this idea of impact assessment? Um, Fundamentally, we're really trying to ask the question, what is the context of the research impact of a resource? And so when we talk about this context and this impact, we have to begin with what are the inputs, right? So we have data, we have software, people, institutions, instruments, methods, funders, and all of these things are combined to produce what would be the core inputs to understanding impact through the outcomes of those inputs. So we always are interested in who and what facilitated a research outcome, right? And so there are these things. It's not just one thing. It's a combination of many of these things together that come together to produce an outcome. And so once we have a fairly good understanding about what are these research inputs, we can then start the process of understanding what is the value of the impact and those outcomes. And so on the right-hand side, you can see a simple visualization of these research inputs, which feed into these outcomes, and the outcomes which feed into your value and impact. And most of us have a pretty good idea about this process, but maybe we don't have a full understanding about how we might get there. So if we talk about how we might get there, we're going to begin with this idea, this concept of identifiers being the backbone of impact tracking. And without these identifiers, as we'll see, sorry about that, we'll get to a much more interesting place in terms of understanding how we could measure impact. When we're looking at impact in the broader scope, we want to think about what is measurable, what are the units of measure, and possibly what are multiple measures. This measurability is very difficult without identifiers, as we're going to see through this presentation. We also know that impact and the evaluation of this impact is dynamic. So impacts can change over time, and a lot of anxiety is produced over when will impact be visible. We're in an era where everyone wants to have their answers yesterday. But we know that that's not exactly how things work. Things are not immediate and they can't be measured. They must be measured over time. And then we have this contextual concept in the evaluation framework for impact. And that is, how are the resources situated in the right context, right? So we know that certain data sets or collections of data sets, for example, are meaningful, and you could point directly to their impact based on what you know about how they came to be and how they are being used, which we'll see in the next slide. So if you take a look at what is happening with the NDE, this screenshot shows, a few of the visuals from the NDE itself and what the portal provides in terms of displaying identifiers. So, for example, here we have both the resource ID and the DOI for this particular resource. We have a pointer to the original resource provider. In this particular case, it's Figshare, and if you click on that, you'll go to the Figshare landing page for the resource. And then you have some information about the usage metrics. So, for example, how many citations, views, and downloads, and these, in this particular case, are specific to what the NDE is collecting about this particular resource. So these views and downloads, for example, are very contextualized directly to the NDE. But if we go outside of this framework and look into, say, dimensions.ai and take a look at the same resource and see what they have to say about the citations, well, because this particular DOI is findable, it's traceable, Dimensions has picked up on actually 3 citations. And if you haven't counted Dimensions, you could log in and actually see this and click on the 3 resources that actually cite this particular data set. So this is, where we can get to a much more interesting picture about how this particular resource is number one, exposed, and number two, citable, made citable, and number three, how that citability and traceability is being picked up by other providers. So if we look at the another example, when I mentioned earlier that we have both item level, or we have item level, collection level, and repository level views on impact. At the item level, for example, we could say a single data source, which has an identifiable identifier. That single resource can be traced directly to citations and usage in other contexts. And then from there, you could build a picture up about, what is the impact and value of this particular resource over time. We also think that it's interesting to consider what collection level view on your resources might look like. So it may not be an individual resource. For example, in this this specific TB study, which I'm not sure it's a little blurry, but there could be multiple resources that, when combined as a collection, end up producing some very interesting outcome that is then traceable back to the resource provider and, of course, the researchers that potentially produce that resource, which then leads us to this repository level. So in the context of how does your repository contribute to these activities and repository contribute to the impact picture, the place where researchers are likely to find that resource should also be made citable, and we'll talk a little bit about, as Matt gets into the recommendation section of our presentation, we'll see just exactly how that could be done. We will want to present that this is a chain of possibilities that might flow from a single to collection to repository provider level. So what are the ideas that we would have for looking at the value proposition for researchers? So we know that, there's this idea of researchers as data producers, right? And if you're actually spending most of your time producing data, you want credit for it, just like those people who are spending most of their time doing the research and publication of that research. And so one of the key points here is that we want to make sure that you're thinking about how you incentivize data producers to deposit data into repositories. And I actually want to just call out that particular bullet, because it's very important to think about, if you are a repository operator, how are you encouraging your depositors and making them feel like this is the place where they need to put their data, and that they feel confident it will actually get exposed, right? And so that's a very important aspect, which leads to obviously transparency, reproducibility, and broadening the context in which this impact can actually be evaluated. So this example is of a data set that has a high impact, and its visibility makes the case for both the repository and that bottom layer, and then the collection to individual resource level. So for the value proposition for funders and repositories together allow you to think about how you could build, say, collaboration networks. So this is something that Matt and I, have worked on here at our organization, to think about how do these resources flow between institutions, and how does one institution's development of a particular research outcome flow into others. Another interesting area that we're finding more and more interest in is in data usage for and within policy documents, right? So as people are writing policy documents, they're using data sets to support the policies that they're proposing. And of course, we know we always want to produce some level of trust in the data that we are presenting, not only to the researchers themselves, but obviously to the other consumers of the data. ROI and future funding priorities, I'm just going to combine them here so we can keep things moving. When you're running a repository, and I'm sure those of you who are on this webinar right now who do this are getting asked multiple questions about how do you demonstrate the value of your repository and how do you demonstrate the ROI? And as we think about constraints where funders are looking at this question more frequently and asking, how do I know funding this in the future is worth the money, effort, et cetera? These types of conversations that we're having today, especially about making things available and exposing these identifiers in ways that make them more citable, become even more relevant. Okay, and so we're going to transition, and this is sort of the last slide. I'm done talking. And the general idea here is that if you look at how do we get to this point where we can demonstrate value, where we can make things more available, where we can actually look at how a repository is impacting the research landscape because it's providing all of these resources to the research communities that it serves. We have a plethora of options in terms of what kinds of identifiers we're talking about. We have ORCIDs, and I'm sure most of you know something about ORCIDs. You have RORs, RIDs, ARCs, DOIs, et cetera. And then you have the systems that are picking up on these things. And of course, these DOI-based systems like Crossref, DataCite, et cetera. And the more these identifiers are used, the easier it is for us to trace them, pick them up, and actually put them into these pictures that we're talking about in terms of impact. So I'm gonna, if you gave me 3 hours, I'd probably still be talking. So I'm gonna actually pass the slides over to Matt, who's my colleague, and he's going to talk about how to make PIDs more visible via citation recommendations. And this sort of lays the foundation for how we get to your repository providing some of the groundwork that we're talking about here. So I'll pass it over to Matt. And if you just let me know when you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. My name is Matt Marinick. I work with Keith as well as the rest of the GoFair team in this topic of citation and impact tracking. So I'm going to talk for a while on a couple sections. This first one is about citation recommendations, and this next handful of slides is based on a new document we've just released on the GoFair website, shown there on the right, citation recommendations for NIAID repositories. And I'll go through these point by point, so I won't talk about them on this slide, but this document provides some high-level recommendations for trying to make your resources and recommended citations for those resources more visible to users in ways that hopefully they're easy to find and use for users of your repositories. Obviously, the document itself, as it says in the title, is focused on the repository viewpoint, but if you're a researcher who produces data, who deposits data into repositories, these might be characteristics that you look for in places that you deposit data, or characteristics that you could ask your repository to consider adding if they don't have them now. So that's the kind of big picture. I guess one more thing I'll say before we move to the next slide is that most of our examples are using DOIs as identifiers and sort of focus on data products. But most of these recommendations, or really all of them, are could be considered to be generic for different types of identifiers, even different types of resources like software, facilities, or things. The same recommendations hold pretty much for any type of object that you're interested in getting citations for. So Keith, go ahead, next slide. So the first point is using PIDs in recommended citations, and this is obviously in line with the rest of the NIAID blueprint document that Reid introduced at the beginning, where there's lots of focus on identifiers. This is just an example of import where a DOI has been assigned to a data study. And a couple of things in terms of getting this sort of citation recommendation discussion started is making PIDs clearly visible is really important. Right? If people don't know they exist, if they can't find them, if they're not readily visible in the context of the resource that they're identifying, people will not cite them and will not use them for that purpose. So have them visible as shown here, have them resolved someplace useful. which means have the identifier perhaps point to this very page, and then connect related identifiers when possible, and we'll come back to that point in the next slide. So go ahead, Keith, to the next one. So the next point here is not just assign PIDs and make those visible, but also make a recommended citation visible. This is an example drawn from the Dryad data repository, which is kind of broadly biological, ecological data, along with other types. And you can see on the right there, they have a citation that's right there, front and center, or not front and center, but top right on their dataset landing page. So you really want to make it clear how you want people to cite data. And in my experience, people are happy to follow recommendations, but if they can't find them, they'll make up whatever they make up, and it will be inconsistent, and they may not do it at all. So again, include PIDs in the recommended citation as shown there on the right. Make it easy for people to copy and paste. You can see the copy button on the top right. Click on that, and you can both copy it and paste it directly in a paper, or perhaps put it into a citation management system, which is the next slide. So go ahead, Keith, next slide, please. There are several different citation management systems. EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley are a couple. BibTeX has its own process for that as well. If you can make your data or your resource more easily imported into those types of systems, that's a really nice feature to provide. These tools themselves are significant time savings in terms of managing citations and large bibliographies for papers and projects. And most of these tools now have support for data sets as distinct types of items. And so you can manage data set citations in the same system as publication citations. And so it's nice to be able to provide all that together. So again, people can cite data sets in the same way they would cite publications from a just sort of a nuts and bolts point of view. What you're seeing in the screenshot, which is from Johns Hopkins, there's a recommended citation. It's the first arrow. You see the DOI in there. And then there's the button that says Cite Dataset. When you click on that, this little box that's highlighted down below shows up where you can download XML into EndNote. You get the BibTeX. RIS is a metadata structure that these citation management tools import very readily. So it has a nice sort of way to import this citation into whatever tool people might be using. So this is a nice way to make it easy. Next slide, please, Keith. The fourth point, which I highlighted before, is connecting resources via metadata and PIDs. So as Keith said at the beginning, data sets, publications, findings, these are not things that are sort of stand on their own. They have connections and chains of association to other resources, data sets, software, instrumentation, people, publications, and so on. And so enabling those to be cross-linked is a great way to allow that sort of impact point to transfer from one to the other. This example from the University of Michigan is just showing at the very bottom is the citation to this data set, and then the top arrow is a citation to related material, in this case, which is a paper, but again, it could be software, instrumentation, or whatever is relevant. So when you have related resources to a data set, adding those to the repository is always helpful to users. And it also makes them more visible. So people who find a data set might find a software package or a paper that's also relevant and interesting for them. And they might cite that instead because that's what they're actually looking for. So this point about connections is both a discoverability and access benefit as well as potentially citation and impact. Next slide, please. The last point, which I will say more about in some slides coming up, is measuring citations and PID use. So this is an example from Keith and my organization, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where it's a data set shown at the top where there's an identifier and there's how to cite this data set. There's a little drop down that shows that you can copy and paste this citation into different formats. There's a couple download buttons for different formats again. And then the point highlighted here on the bottom is that this shows, this is a data repository website, that this paper has been cited 111 times, and it has a list of all those papers. And so this is a way, an example of both using citations as, not just a sort of impact assessment, but also as a way to show users who else might have used this resource and sort of demonstrate potential uses for data sets. And this number was drawn from some of the services that I'll talk about in the next section. So what I want to highlight here on this slide is that citation metrics like this complement other measures of data use. If you're a repository, you probably count page views, download counts. Those are usually things that are not too difficult to count. Citations provide another viewpoint in complementing those other types of metrics. But also there's a couple other potential uses for access and citation metrics, which might show usability challenges. If there's a data set that is not getting used or not getting cited, or it's not getting cited, but it's getting used, then that might tell you that your citation your recommendations is not being seen, or people are using your data set, they're downloading it a lot, but they're not citing it. That might be an indicator that your process of recommending a citation is not working. You also might see that there's different audiences for different data sets. So, this data set might be downloaded 111 times or cited 111 times, but another data set that gets used a lot in education by students may not get cited because students don't cite papers or don't write papers in the same way, right? They use it for educational purposes. So sometimes differential counts in metrics are not just sort of showing impact, they might also be showing different use patterns and different usage communities. So those are the 5 things that are highlighted in that website that I mentioned. So if you're interested in these topics, there's more detail on those pages. So next slide, please, Keith. So now we're going to transition into the kind of last major section here, which is looking at, well, how do we measure impact once we've assigned some identifiers and maybe tried to have these citation recommendations more visible on our repository websites? How do we go about trying to find this information? There's several different services that are available to look up citation information, and they have different characteristics. Some of you are probably quite familiar with some and maybe less so with others. I'm going to go through some of these, not all of them one by one, but we'll highlight a couple of them and show a few examples from ones you may be less familiar with. There's free services, there's services that have APIs, there's searches that do full text search, that do metadata search only. There's some subscription services that cost money that you may or may not have access to, depending on if your organization has subscribed to those. So this is definitely an ecosystem of tools. I would say even within our team, our GoFair team, we're still kind of parsing which of these services are most optimally used for which purposes. As it says at the bottom, these are dynamic, they're evolving. Some of them are somewhat new. They have overlaps and gaps, which come back to, and sometimes the integration of identifiers is inconsistent. So really what we wanted to do with this section is just to make sure you're aware of various systems, what their capabilities are, so you might investigate them further. Next slide, please. So we'll touch on some of these pretty quickly because you're probably familiar with Google Scholar. It's Google's literature service. I will put at the top as well a link to Google's dataset search, which is newer and you may be less familiar with, which tries to do something similar as Google Scholar, but for data sets. It's an aggregator of information. The Google dataset search does have some citation information for datasets, which draws from Google Scholar, which is why I put them together, because they're essentially pulling on the same source when it comes to citations for datasets. But if you've used Google Scholar, you're probably familiar with this, that its benefit is that it's the broadest corpus, right? Google has the broadest scoop. They're great at indexing, a lot of stuff. They have full text searching, which is very nice. It's quick, it works well. They provide citation counts, citing articles, things like that. The big limitation on Google Scholar, there's a couple of them, is that there's no API. I put on the right, there's a few hacks that exist, which we've looked at, and I can't say they're fully successful, but essentially there's no API. So what you get through the interface is what you get. If you get a result of 2,000, articles or whatever, then you either don't look at them or you have to parse them by hand. The other thing is that the quality control is, essentially there's no quality control. So the results change from day to day sometimes if you follow the same search closely. And that's not just always going up. Sometimes the same search will have fewer results. The same articles will have fewer citations the next day. It can be quite dynamic in terms of what you get back from Google Scholar. They don't have any specific support for PIDs in terms of indexing of certain types. But any of them can be searched as free text. So you can put anything in Google Scholar. So that's kind of the baseline, the broadest results, but also the most questionable outcomes. Next slide, please. PubMed and PubMed Central, likewise, I'm not going to say a whole lot about because these are probably ones you're familiar with. It's provided by the NIH. free archives of citation and also full text biomedical literature. Obviously the good thing about it is it's quite comprehensive for biomed focused articles. It's got good full text searching. They have robust APIs. There's a lot of good services here. The potential limitation, and this kind of depends on what your focus is and sort of where your work centers, is that the scope is to biomed focused literature. So if you have resources that might be used by other communities in addition to biomed, you might not be getting the full view on the papers that might be using your resource. They do have good support for IDs, as shown on the bottom right, in terms of indexing of specific types of identifiers. So that's a benefit of this service. So again, probably one you're familiar with. So we'll move on to the next slide. The next one is newer, a service that again, I think we were still investigating to kind of see its strengths and weaknesses and some of the boundaries. It's called OpenAlex. This comes out actually of a Microsoft project, but has since gone to an open source project that is free and openly available. This is a fully open catalog of the global research system, hundreds of millions of scholarly works, our authors, institutions. This is in some ways kind of a competitor, an open competitor to like Web of Science or the subscription services, which we'll touch on in a later slide. Citation indexing, literature indexing, things like that Web of Science would do, but in an open and free context. So this is free. It's a large corpus. It's got a robust API. They do provide citation counts, citing articles. The limitation here, which is like other services, is this is metadata searching only, so you don't get full text search with this service. But they do have some good indexing for certain types of identifiers, and it's, again, broad coverage. So I think we have an example on the next slide. Keith, can go to the next slide. So I did a search for ACTT1, which is a data set from the Access Clinical Data at NIAID data set. And you can see this is just a free text search. I'm not searching for an identifier here. You can kind of see in the top left and in the query shown on the bottom, there's a filter. So I was able to filter this by years from 2020 forward, because this is a data set related to COVID-19. So anything that shows up from 2010 is not relevant to this query. It's got the works shown on the left. And these are then potentially relevant works. You can see the date range, topics. So again, something like ACTT that could have false hits for other acronyms in other fields that have that same acronym. So you'd be able to investigate that by looking at the topics, all of which look relevant in this case. Some institutions shown on the right, open access information on the top right. So again, OpenAlex provides quite a bit of associated information about these papers, not just a list of papers. They also have nice APIs. So again, if you search the same search in Google Scholar, you probably would get much, much larger results, just because everything you search in Google Scholar gets larger results. But you wouldn't have the ability to pull these articles into a website and display them, associated with this data set. So I think OpenAlex would be a potential source for ways for API-based access to articles that you could query and pull into a data repository service might be associated with a data set. Again, this is a newer service, so we're still, I think, working on ourselves kind of what the benefits are, but that seems to be a good use. Just wanted to mention a few more that have specific PID associations. One is SciCrunch, which is a service that provides research resource identifiers, or RRIDs, Keith mentioned earlier. These are types of identifiers that initially started out with like reagents, cell strains, sort of ways of identifying materials that were used as inputs to a project to kind of ensure reproducibility and traceability of those resources. But RRIDs are now being assigned more broadly to instrumentation, data facilities, software. I'll show an example on the next slide. This service that they provide does essentially literature searching through PubMed for resources that mention or are associated with that RRID. It is a free service. They got APIs. This is focused only on RRIDs, so would not be relevant if that's not something you're interested in. So next slide, Keith, just to show an example here. So the Immune Epitope Database and Analysis Resource, IEDB, has an RRID assigned, shown at the top left. And as you kind of look down there towards the bottom left, shows mentions in open access literature, 383 in this case. And then these are a few articles shown, and you would be able to get this full list. What's interesting about this is that their service that compiles these numbers does not just look at that RRID. They also look at the URL. And when I say look at, I mean they're searching PubMed for these sort of phrases or strings. But they're looking for the URL, the name, some of the synonyms. They're shown kind of in the middle of the page. So their service actually goes much broader than just the ID. It looks for various other terms that are associated with this resource and then combines them together. So there are several NIAID repositories that already have RIDs assigned, and of course lots of specific resources like again software packages, reagents, things of that nature also have RIDs. So this could be a useful tool if RID is on your landscape. Next slide. Just quickly mention a couple services if you do assign DOIs to data sets already. Crossref and DataCite are the DOI providers. Crossref largely is used for DOIs for publications, DataCite for data sets, software, and kind of non-publications. They both have citation services where you can query them through either the interface or APIs and get information back about who's been citing a DOI, citation count, citing articles provided. These are metadata-only searches. And again, these are focused on DOI. So if you don't have DOIs, this may not be that useful to you at this point. So for the sake of time, we'll go on to the next slide. Just going to mention these paid services. You might be familiar with these. You might already have access to some of these, Web of Science, Scopus, Dimensions. They have some differences, but they're roughly comparable in terms of competitor products. They're standard citation indexes of peer-reviewed journals. Some of them have also the ability to query for DOIs of other types of things like data sets. Web of Science has a data citation index that's part of their product line. Dimensions, you can search for kind of any DOI. So all of these are useful if you have access to them. Obviously, as subscription services, they can be quite costly, and you may not have access to them already. So just mention these. If you do have access to these are potentially useful to you. If you don't, then then they're not. So let's move on again for the sake of time. So here's the summary of some very high-level characteristics of these services. Full text is useful, but is not always the case. In fact, it's not. Most of these services do not provide full text searching. Metadata searching is kind of the coin of the realm here. Many of them are free, except for, of course, the category I mentioned at the end. A couple of them are PID specific, and then most of them have APIs, except for Google Scholar. And of course, for the bottom category, these are paid APIs. So these would be paid services as well. So these might be sort of a quick reference. Just wanted to show this. This is some folks have studied, the overlap of these services. I think this is an important point that these are not fully comparable in terms of what they index and what they provide. And so these were some folks from NASA who did some searches for data sets and publications in various services and found the overlaps. You can see on the top left, Google Scholar, Web of Science, Scopus. You could Crossref on the right. And on the bottom right, DataCite was part of their scope as well. And I just wanted, the details are not important. Just wanted to make the point that any one service is not going to give you the full picture of what papers might be citing your resource. So you may want to think about a combination of them. And the example that I showed earlier of NCAR providing a list of 111 citations for that given data set. That was an example where they pulled from multiple services to produce that. So these services all have strengths and weaknesses, and you may want to consider looking at a couple to see if you are getting a fuller picture than just from one. Next slide, please, Keith. So circling kind of away from the system side, want to emphasize this point, which is that communication with users is really important. Assigning a PID like a DOI is a starting point, but in and of itself doesn't solve anything, right? You really need people to use them and to cite them and to put them in their papers and things like that. So, typically assigning a PID itself is quite easy, but regular communication with users is essential. Doing that in multifaceted and ways, regular ways is important. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't need to be like a whole new communication effort. Actually, connecting this to regular communication methods is the most effective way. So if you already have documentation pages, have this very clearly documented on your documentation pages on your repository. This is how we want you to cite this, clearly called out. If you already do newsletters or emails to your user communities, include a sort of snippet, in those every time you send that out. Oh, by the way, we really would appreciate if you can, cite our resource when you use it, and here's how we'd like you to do that. If you do webinars or you do training, have a slide in there that says, please also make sure you reference us in this way when you write papers. I want to also emphasize, which is true for all citation metrics, they build slowly, right? People might download something now, today and write a paper using that 2 years from now. So there is often a time lag. They need to complement other metric gathering approaches, such as user surveys, literature searches that you might already be doing. The good thing about these PID-based metrics is you can feel confident that there's a high likelihood these papers have benefited from your resources. Again, doing a Google Scholar search that shows you 2,000 things that you can't actually investigate, you don't have a whole lot of confidence in what that is telling you. Next slide, Keith. So we're getting to the end here. A couple key takeaways on the researcher side. Make it easy for people to cite your data. Work with repositories that provide PIDs and recommended citations. Look to see how they recommend the citations and maybe ask them to adjust that if you don't think it's satisfactory. As a user of data, cite PIDs and data yourself when possible. Connect your data sets to your ORCID identifier if you have an ORCID identifier. If data repositories take your ORCID, provide that so that they can make that connection. And you can also add data sets directly to your ORCID profile. Again, look for repositories that have features following our suggested guidance. And in terms of searching and indexing, try out some of these tools. They might be interesting, provide some new ways of finding things that existing tools that you use don't provide. Next slide, please. And likewise, on the other side, the resource and repository provider side, as Keith said, think about what level you want to assess impact. Is it at the repository level? Is it at the individual item level? Maybe somewhere in between. Using PIDs, as we've talked about, and the blueprint recommends. Make it easy for people to cite your data. That's really the key point, as well as communicating regularly and often with people about how to do that. Make it part of your regular communication process. See our suggested guidance. And think about, again, how multiple services might fit together and multiple approaches in terms of assessing impact. I do want to also emphasize this point that there's often a trade-off in terms of sort of small-scale analyses versus large-scale analyses. A service that provides an easy API, you might be able to search, hundreds of identifiers and get sort of some high top-level information. But sometimes doing a really deep-level analysis of, one or two things can show you something different than the sort of broad-scale sweep of a whole bunch of items. So there is a tension, I think, between how many things you're trying to assess impact for and kind of how deep you can go on any one of them. And so I think we're pretty much done here. I'll just pull this up to show this was the results from the pre-webinar registration poll. And so as Keith said at the beginning, we know some of you have some familiarity with these topics. Some of you are just learning and starting kind of from the baseline. And so we're happy to have some questions and hear what you're interested in talking about more. So Christine, I'll turn it to you to moderate the discussion.
Yeah, well, and it looks like some of the questions were, we had a lot of questions, but some were answered, as you said, with the slides. So I know a couple people on our team are in the process of typing answers to some of those. So maybe actually we'll go first to Randy Vita. If I know it's a webinar, so I'm not sure if it's how the unmuting works or if I need to do it for you. Let's see here. Let me try.
I think you gave me permission to unmute.
Okay, there we go. Please go ahead and ask your question.
It appeared on the screen magically.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, I didn't really hear mentioned journals, because I think journals are a major player in this. If the journal asks authors to cite data sets and to cite their own data set and where they submitted it and to cite the resources they used, then people cite them. But if journals don't look at that or encourage it, it often doesn't get done.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're absolutely right. The journals are a huge part of this ecosystem. I think we were in this case trying to talk about things that we have more control over, just to some
Yeah,
extent.
but you can take control. You
Yeah,
can be forceful
yeah. So I
about
mean,
it. Push it.
we as the broader scientific community, hopefully, do have some control over our journals. I will say that in the meteorology space, which is where Keith and I work more, there's been a lot of work with journals, and the bigger societies that publish the main journals do have recommendations or it's really requirements at this point on people citing data sets and software in particular,
Yeah.
and making those visible in a specific availability section of papers. So if you have opportunity to work with journals, absolutely, that's a great thing. There are elements, again, of the journal ecosystem that are a little bit hard to control because publishers, large publishers, you might publish hundreds of journals and they are hesitant to customize something for a single journal. But if you have that opportunity, that's a great thing to do. Asking editors, talking to, when you submit a paper, making these part of your own citation lists. So yeah, definitely, I fully agree with that.
And Matt, we have another question from Andrew Hasley. Drew asks, what is the current state of resources that track PIDs for things like citation, downloads, views in terms of proprietary versus free and open? So anything more you want to say about that?
Sorry, I'm trying to find that question. Could you say it again, please, Christine?
Sure. Yeah, the current state of resources that track PIDs for citation, downloads, and views, proprietary versus free and open.
Yeah, Keith, do you want to go back
Yeah.
one or two slides, or do you want to answer that?
Yeah, let's go back. You wanted to go
One more.
probably one more. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I
So
mean,
go ahead, Keith.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, and then you can enhance what I'm saying. I think that there are, let's just say, the free and open tools are gaining quite a bit of ground. What we've seen in the last really 2 years has been pretty tremendous, especially from the likes of OpenAlex, for example. With If we were to talk about our own experience within our organization, we find that there is some unevenness with some of the proprietary tools. I think some of this is driven by the way some of these tools are, they settle in on particular journals. We find sometimes where journal coverage on some services varies. So you might have one service that has better journal coverage on another, and so you'll get mixed results in terms of what kind of citation coverage you might get. And we also find that the services like Crossref seem to be doing a pretty good job of keeping up with, and most of the metadata in Crossref is freely available up to certain points and limits of usage and things. So, but I think generally speaking, the proprietary or publisher-based services, they settle in on sort of a journal perspective, and their coverage of journals dictates how good their coverage is across the entire landscape.
I'll just add one point, which is that for the most part, these services they provide related to metrics are citation focused. So you don't really find download counts as much in, say, APIs or these systems. Sometimes they have them on their web page, but those tend to be less part of these services in terms of sort of the ability to access them easily. They tend to focus on citation metrics, and the download metrics may or may not be displayed, but is usually not, say, part of the API.
So we have another question where someone asks, if a resource has a PID, does that make it more likely that it will be found by OpenAlex, Google Scholar, and others?
So I think the answer is yes, but it also depends a little bit. Google Scholar, I think it's more looking for things that look like articles. Google Scholar is the they're sort of crawling the web, right? It's part of the web crawl ecosystem that Google does. So I don't think that they necessarily pull things in because it has a DOI. I think it's more if it looks like an article in terms of the structure of the website and it's got, authors and things like that, they will pull it in and then the DOI will come in with that. But it's definitely, DOIs definitely propagate through these sites more than other types of identifiers. There's many other types of identifiers that have good uses, but if the use case is citation, like Crossref and DataCite, that's kind of their coin. Web of Science, Scopus Dimensions, they use DOIs to, consolidate things. So they tend to propagate more than other types of IDs.
And
Okay,
I'll
so
add, yeah, oh, I'm sorry, good.
oh no, I'm just going to reflect back. So PIDs are key, but some persistent identifiers might be easier than others as far as some of this collection with the different services at the moment.
As far as the citation part of it, yeah. So like just since it's on this slide, our IDs are not indexed by, say, Web of Science or Google Scholar in the same way that the DOIs would be. They have their own purpose and they're very valuable, and SciCrunch provides good services associated with them, but they don't propagate through these networks in the same way that DOIs do.
Sorry about that, Keith.
Yeah, no worries. And I was going to reinforce that with one of the reasons why, if it's a DOI, it's, I think the answer to your question is yes, mostly because you register your DOI and the metadata is made available and exposed almost directly and as soon as that DOI is registered. So services pick up on that and index everything that they can get from Crossref once it's registered. So yes, if it's a DOI. Yeah.
I'll just add one more thing, which is that these services definitely feed into each other. So like OpenAlex now indexes all of DataCite, which is, dataset DOIs. So there's definitely flow of metadata, particularly among these open systems.
Yeah.
And Keith, could you go back to the poll questions real quick?
Yeah, sure.
The next question, Zarina writes, since I'm still learning, and the reason we put this up is to let you know you are not alone, that this is an area where generally you need to talk to an expert, although the experts have shown us how you can do some of these things yourself. So all that to say, if you're in this webinar asking yourself, gosh, am I the only one that doesn't know how to use all these different services? No, I turn to Matt and Keith and ask them for help with these things too. So you're definitely not alone. This is yeah, a specialty skill. But the question is, can you speak about a strategy that would integrate many or all of these sources of information to highlight the impact of a repository? Are there widgets that could be embedded in the repository website?
So there's a little bit of a kind of it depends question. So again, these are all independent services. So using more than one of them does require to kind of figure out how to pull in information from more than one. That's what we've done in our organization. One of our colleagues, he essentially was using the API from I think 3 or 4 of them and pulling information in, the same kind of query. He built a little database. He did some disambiguation and then displayed that number that I showed, which was 100, 111 or whatever on that one slide. So I think there is a little bit of custom work needed on that. I don't know of any standard service that cuts across all of them. Again, partly because some of them are subscription based, and so they kind of make that hard. Again, because some information does flow between them. OpenAlex, I'm sure indexes PubMed, so you might get a broader view there. But I do think that that's a bit of a challenge in this space right now, is that because they're discrete and distinct, pulling from more than one does take some custom integration. Keith, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that's fair to say, and I think you've kind of emphasized an important point, which is the proprietary and paid services will, increase the friction quite a bit, to get you to buy their service ultimately, right? Which is kind of the point of their existence.
Well, and this might be a good place where we can take this as a follow-up item to try and think a little bit more about your question and what kind of resources that we could suggest, or kind of a minimum viable strategy and what one might do. So thank you so much for that. And now we have a question from Evan who asks, can you share any insights or experience with tracking data set impact further downstream? Um, they're interested in knowing when their data set has been used to inform clinical studies, clinical trials, clinical guidelines, patents, and clinical products. And I know that this is also tracked. People like to look at when data is used to shape, say, federal policy, for example.
Yeah, I don't know that we have great insights there. I think some of these services do index patents. I think Google Scholar has a patent search, so that might be something that's useful there. Um, the potential benefit of identifiers is if people are using those, you should be able to hopefully find them even through generic Google searches wherever they're mentioned. I think this also relates back to the point I made towards the end about the sort of tension between getting a broad sort of view versus sort of a digging down in a narrow sense on a single resource. Sometimes, talking to users is a great way of getting that. Um, if you sort of know that there's a policy component to what your data sets are being used for, so trying to get some insight from perhaps users through a survey. So I do think this is a challenge as well. Most of these services are based on literature. Other types of resources that are outside of that are not quite as visible.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. Here's another question, and maybe I'll flip the order of the questions. So someone asks, uh, is the strength of PIDs and the reusability of the resource and tracking the impact of that reuse more than the other, the F, the A, and the I? And here's the longer question. Would it be accurate to say that PIDs themselves don't make a resource more findable, accessible, or interoperable, but that the structure of the metadata associated with the PID and sometimes of the resource itself does?
I think that's mostly fair. I've definitely, had discussions with people where they assigned a DOI and never put it anywhere and even forgot they assigned it a couple years later. And 5 years later, somebody else from the same team came and asked me to assign a DOI to something that already had been assigned one. So I do think assigning a PID, if that's all you do, doesn't get you a whole lot. As Keith said before, if for many PID services that have metadata associated with them, if the DOI or PID is getting assigned with metadata associated with it, it does immediately become visible to other services that might be looking for, looking for these things. So assigning a DOI or PID with metadata that's part of a larger system does increase its accessibility. So I think it does connect to the A part. Yeah, the use cases for PIDs, there's citation tracking, but there's also sort of the provenance and reproducibility point where you can distinctly point people to that resource. I think this is a distinction between citing, say, a data set and a paper that describes that data set or had the initial findings of that data set. A paper is sort of static, whereas a data set might change over time. You might have other things added to it. You might have, more data added to it. So a data set and a paper might deviate. So pointing people directly to a data set or, the same thing with software, to a software package is, there's sort of better from a provenance and reproducibility point of view than pointing people to a paper, which, may have been published 5 years ago. That might be a little bit different. So I think the identifiers play into all aspects of FAIR, but just assigning one doesn't get you a whole lot into some of those FA and I and R. Does that
Thanks
address
so
your
much.
question?
And Keith, could I ask you to advance to now that we're at the top of the hour, to the registration link?
Oops, yeah, they were.
So we hope that you will save the date We have a new webinar coming up May 27th, same time, lunch hour if you're on the East Coast, 9 a.m. Pacific. Increasing findability and interoperability, introducing you to the core metadata schema from the blueprint. And I do want to thank everyone who put this webinar together. I apologize for the last question we didn't get right to in the chat. And thank you, David Lowe, who reminds us that Dimensions does index the clinical trials and public policy in the 4Fee version. So there's a lot of great information we have in the community for thinking about how we measure impact and putting all of this together. Thanks so much. Next slide to the whole team at OddSet for all of their input and feedback, and for our funders and the team at GoFair US. Any last words, Reed?
No, just thank you, Christine, for leading this. Thank you to Keith. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to the entire team, and hope everybody has a wonderful day. I'm going to listen to the discussion recording to reabsorb all of that interesting back and forth. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.